A gray winter dawn bled slowly across the sky, the clouds so thick and heavy they seemed to hang just above the trees. The world was colorless, smeared in shades of frost and sorrow. Elsie Mae stood barefoot on the splintered wooden platform of Elmira Depot, her small body wrapped in a coat too thin for the biting cold. Wisps of hair clung to her damp face, streaked with the salt of old tears. The old station clock on the wall above her head ticked with a deliberate, ancient rhythm, its hand resting stubbornly at 5:42, as though refusing to move forward, trapping them all in this endless hour. Far off down the line, the bell of a freight train clanged, a mournful echo in the morning stillness. Ice-laden clouds rolled overhead, casting everything in a pale, leaden light. Children stood in clusters and loose lines, their faces turned down or staring listlessly toward the tracks. An older woman with a black bonnet pulled tight around her pinched face called names from a worn ledger, her voice sharp as a hawk's cry. One by one, thin arms raised at the sound of their names, weary eyes finding the woman's face, then lowering again. Elsie turned, glancing toward the line of dark woods beyond the depot fence. No one came. No one would. Her throat tightened, the strip of faded, soft cloth in her hand, the corner of her mother's apron, felt warm and worn against her fingers. She clutched it tighter, pressing it into her palm until the ache in her chest dulled, just a little. Beside her, a small boy no older than 8 coughed into his fist. The sound was wet and hollow. No one paid him any mind. The station agent, a broad man with a gray mustache, stood at his table beneath the overhang, scribbling notes into a ledger without ever looking up. His ink pen scratched across the paper, tallying them like cattle. Then came the sound that seemed to split the air, the low, grinding hum of an approaching train. Around the bend it came, black smoke trailing behind like a funeral shroud. The sharp, metallic whistle pierced the stillness, and a flock of crows burst from the trees in a scatter of dark wings. No one smiled. The children stiffened, some clasping hands, others curling into themselves. A voice barked, "Line up now! On your feet!" And the children moved like sleepwalkers, drawn by fear and numbness into a line along the platform's edge. Elsie shuffled forward, her toes curling against the cold wood. She felt the rough grain bite against her skin. She hesitated, turning one last time, and her eyes caught on a lone figure leaning against a weathered fence post by the far end of the yard. A man thin, with a battered hat slung low over his brow, a coat hanging loose over his shoulders. He didn't move. His eyes, sharp and pale as ice water, stayed fixed on her. A hand yanked her forward. "Keep the line." She stumbled, the cloth nearly falling from her grasp. The wind carried the smoke and cold grit toward them as the train ground to a stop. Iron wheels screeched against frozen tracks. The children were herded toward the looming train cars, long, dark, and waiting. An open door revealed rows of narrow benches and scratchy woolen blankets. A cracked window let in a steady stream of frigid air. Elsie clutched the cloth tightly and stepped up. The door slammed behind her, a sound that echoed like a vault ceiling shut. Inside the dim car, the air reeked of coal smoke, old wood, and fear. She slid onto a bench by the window, placing her hands in her lap, the little strip of cloth still clutched between them. A girl with hollow cheeks and stringy hair sat beside her, humming something tuneless under her breath. No one else spoke. The train jolted once, then lurched forward with a grinding groan. The depot began to slide away. Trees stood skeletal against the morning sky, their branches black claws against a field of ash-gray clouds. Elsie stared through the grime-streaked glass, and there, still by the fence post, the man remained, his shoulders hunched against the wind, his gaze unbroken. As the distance grew, his hand lifted slowly once. Elsie pressed her hand to the window pane. The cold bit into her palm, stung her skin. The train gathered speed. Smoke poured past the window in long, dirty streaks. The man vanished behind it, swallowed by the blur of the world sliding past. The car swayed and rattled. A name shouted, a child's thin cry, a heavy hand grabbing a shoulder. The sound of the rails pounded through the floorboards and into her bones. Elsie leaned her forehead against the cold glass, closing her eyes for a moment, the cloth in her hand warm from the heat of her grip. The last sight of home, or whatever passed for it, gone. Only the endless, white stretch of winter and unknown places ahead. The train moved through endless fields where snow buried the world, drift swallowing fence lines, smothering trees, erasing the shapes of old barns and crooked houses. Ice crystals clung thick to the window panes, turning the landscape to blurred ghosts of white and gray. Inside the railcar, the children sat in hunched silence. No chatter, no songs, no laughter. Small shoes swung above the worn wooden floor. Tiny fingers clutched at frayed hems or gripped tightly at whatever scraps they'd brought along from wherever they'd come. Mrs. Calloway sat near the front of the car, her black bonnet tied tight beneath her sharp chin. She ran a pale, crooked finger down a list in a worn ledger, whispering names, pausing beside one to confer with the orphan agent who rode with them. The man, broad-shouldered with gray whiskers and a thick coat, glanced at a sickly boy near the stove. The boy's head sagged to one side, his cheeks sunken. The agent grunted and scribbled something down. Elsie pressed her forehead to the cold glass, watching the world smear by. The cloth in her fist was damp with sweat, her fingers having worked it into a wrinkled knot. Out there, everything was white. The sky, the land, the trees. Even the air seemed thick with snow. The train slowed at a small town with a leaning water tower that read Arden in peeling black paint. The children were lined up, boots crunching against ice-dusted planks. A man with cracked hands and a ragged scarf stepped up, pointing to the sickly boy by the stove. No words were exchanged. The boy was lifted from his place on the bench and carried like a sack of grain toward a cart hitched to a single weary horse. The boy didn't struggle, didn't look back. The train jolted forward before anyone else could move, the boy disappearing behind a veil of smoke and sleet. Later, at another stop whose name Elsie never caught, a sharp-eyed woman stepped aboard. Her long wool coat brushed the floor, and her narrow eyes darted over the children like a butcher choosing a cut. She stopped before a girl with limp blonde hair, grabbed her chin, and turned her head this way and that. She pried open the girl's mouth, prodded her teeth, checked her palms. Without a word, the girl was led away. The agent doffed his hat. The train left before the girl's seat cooled. At dusk, the train rattled to a halt beside a deserted siding. No depot, no platform. A single barrel of fire burned, the flames flickering orange against the dark blue snow. The wind clawed through every crack in the walls. The children shivered, huddled together in their too thin coats. Names were called out into the cold. Another child gone. Then another. Elsie sat rigid, hoping not to hear her own name, fearing what would happen if she did, dreading what would happen if she didn't. The train pulled away, a thin trail of smoke vanishing into the heavy dark. Her stomach ached, hollow and sharp. They'd been given no supper. A piece of bread at morning, a sip of weak broth. Nothing since. Beside her, the girl who hummed, a gaunt thing with stringy hair and hollow eyes, was gone by dawn. Elsie never saw her leave, never heard a sound. The place on the bench felt colder without her. The snow deepened. The rails shrieked under the weight of the cold. At towns they never named, men and women gathered in heavy coats and mudcake boots, their faces chapped and lined. They inspected the children like horses at market, pulled open mouths, pinched arms, measured heights, checked for strong backs, clear skin, teeth without rot. A girl named Mary was taken by a brittle old woman in a cloak so thick, with frost it cracked when she moved. Mary didn't look at anyone as she climbed down. She waved to no one. In one place, a boy resisted. His hands grabbed at the bench as a tall man reached for him. The boy's cry was sharp, panicked, a single burst of sound in a car that had forgotten what voices were for. The man struck him hard across the side of the head. The sound of it cracked through the brittle air like a rifle shot. Elsie flinched, her fingers knotting tighter around the scrap of cloth, pressing it to her lips to keep the ache in her chest from spilling out. That night, the car lantern swung with the motion of the train, throwing long, crooked shadows across the floor and walls. The flame's light made the frost on the glass glow, turning the outside world into a wall of shifting, icy white. Elsie curled beneath her thin coat, eyes half closed, her mind drifting to the fields back home. She could almost feel the sun on her skin, the soft green grass beneath her toes. A voice called out in that place, warm and clear. Elsie May. Her mother's voice, or the memory of it. A jolt. The train clanged over a crossing. A name shouted. Not hers. Another child taken. At dawn, the train rattled into a new station. A cluster of townsfolk stood waiting beside a depot roofed in sagging shingles. The ground was thick with mud and slush, gray snow mashed under heavy boots. The names began again. Elsie's came sooner than she expected. Her legs felt strange as she stood, lightheaded. The cold sunk deep into her bones. She moved toward the door, down the steps, the cloth gripped in her fist. A man stepped forward, taller than most, with a gray overcoat and wire spectacles. His hair was slicked back, his chin shaved to a sharp point. He squinted at her like she was a strange kind of livestock. Too thin, he said to the agent. A pause. Hair too dark. Without a word, he turned away. Elsie stood there for a moment, the cold gnawing at her fingertips, the wind tugging at her hair. Behind her, Mrs. Calloway's voice barked. A hand grabbed her shoulder, turning her back toward the car. The door clanged shut. The train rolled on, deeper into the endless white. A final town appeared through the thinning morning mist. The land rose into a narrow gulch hemmed in by frost-heavy pines, their limbs sagging under the weight of new snow. Smoke hung low over the clustered rooftops, drifting from crooked chimneys into the pale, sluggish sky. The rails led straight into it, the tracks splitting the trees like a knife through white linen. Elsie felt her heartbeat in her throat, a cold, sick pulse that made her chest ache. The train slowed with a long, aching screech of metal against metal. A whistle cut through the fog, sharp, final. The sound echoed against the pines and rolled out over the valley like a warning no one answered. A single platform, no more than a length of planks worn gray and slick with frost. A few men and women waited, bundled in coarse coats, faces lined and unreadable. They shifted their weight from foot to foot, breath fogging in the brittle air. One figure stood alone at the far end, away from the rest, a dark silhouette against the rising mist. The train sighed to a stop. Doors swung open. The children, what was left of them, were lined up in the cold. Small shoes on cracked planks. Pale faces turned toward the ground. The wind slipped between them, carrying the scent of smoke, damp wood, and the iron tang of the rails. Names were called. One by one, the children left the line. Some were taken by broad-handed farmers, others by sharp-eyed wives with tight mouths and narrow chins. A boy with a cough. A girl with pale curls. Another boy with eyes like water. The line thinned. Elsie stayed where she was, the scrap of cloth still balled in her fist, stiff with old sweat and the smell of coal dust. Only three remained. Elsie, a boy with a twisted foot, and a girl too young to speak her own name. Mrs. Calloway's voice rang out. Elsie May Pritchard. Her legs felt strange as she stepped forward, stiff from cold and too many nights cramped on a narrow bench. The world tilted slightly as she moved. She kept her eyes low. A tall man stepped out from the waiting group, broad in the shoulders, his beard streaked with dark gray, heavy boots crusted with frozen mud. His eyes moved over her like a man inspecting a fence post for cracks. He didn't speak, just grunted once and gave a short, sharp nod. She'll do. Mrs. Calloway scribbled in her ledger, her thin lips tight. Elsie took one step toward him, the cloth in her hand. Then a voice. Not her. It wasn't shouted. No anger in it. Just a flat, steady thing that cut through the cold like a blade. A man stepped out from the mist by the tracks. His coat hung loose over narrow shoulders. His face weathered and lined, his eyes sharp and colorless as ice. Eyes that saw her. The platform went still. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. He moved between Elsie and the tall man. Stood there like he'd always belonged in that space. She's claimed. Mrs. Calloway's voice cracked like a whip. She's assigned, sir. You'll not interfere. The stranger's hand shifted near his coat pocket. Not a threat, just emotion. Enough. His gaze never left hers. A moment passed, heavy as storm clouds, so thick you could feel it press against your skin. The tall man spat into the snow. A dark, wet blot. "Take her, then." He turned away, his boots crunching frost as he disappeared into the waiting cluster of townsfolk. Elsie didn't move. Couldn't. Her bones felt hollow. The stranger knelt down in front of her. His hand reached out, rough and scarred, the skin darkened by weather and old labor. He didn't speak, not at first. Then, soft as the hush before snowfall, "Come on, girl." Her fingers loosened. The cloth fell from her palm, a limp, faded scrap in the snow. She placed her hand in his. Behind them, the train bell clattered. A door slammed. The engine groaned and began to move, wheels grinding over ice-clad rails. Faces pressed to the grimy glass. Children's eyes followed her, wide and empty. No one spoke. The train picked up speed, smoke trailing behind it, swallowing the faces, the town, the station. The stranger walked. Elsie followed. The cold bit at her face. The snow crunched beneath her steps. Pine branches hung low over the path, brushing her shoulders. A crow called once from a high branch. He said nothing until the platform was long out of sight, the pines thick around them, the world narrowed to white and shadow. Then his voice came, low and certain. "You're home now." Elsie didn't answer. She only held tighter to his hand. They walked in silence. The world narrowed to the sound of snow crunching beneath their boots. The air was sharp, and Elsie's face burned with cold, her skin raw where the wind scraped against it. The man's hand stayed steady in hers, rough and calloused, his stride unhurried. He didn't speak, and she didn't ask. No questions, no explanations, just the cold and the trees, and the pale sky pressing down. The pines closed in around them, tall and silent, their branches drooping heavy with snow. It clung to the needles in thick clumps, making the world quiet. Each step muffled, each breath a faint mist. Ahead, through a break in the trees, a small shack appeared, slumped against the snowdrifts, smoke curling thinly from a crooked chimney. A fence leaned under the weight of ice. The snow came almost to the bottom of the window shutters. No other footprints, but theirs marked the path. A dog barked once, low and hoarse from inside. Then quiet. The man opened the door and gestured for her to go in. Inside, the warmth hit her like a wave. The air smelled of wood smoke and coffee and something faintly sweet. A fire burned in the stone hearth, its light chasing the shadows into corners. A patchwork quilt was draped over the back of a worn chair. A battered Bible rested on a table beside a half-empty lamp. The room was small, the ceiling low, walls lined with shelves crowded with tools and old tins. He pointed to the chair. Elsie moved to it and sat. The heat of the fire worked its way into her bones, pulling the ache from her fingers and the sharp cold from her cheeks. He broke a piece of bread and handed it to her, poured water from a kettle into a tin cup. She took them both without speaking, eating slowly. The bread was rough, thick with grit, but sweet somehow in its plainness. The man removed his hat and set it on a peg near the door. Gray streaked his temples. Scars crisscrossed his knuckles, one finger missing at the middle joint. The lines in his face were deep, as though carved there by years of wind and sun and loss. Above the hearth hung a single photograph. A woman with dark hair sat holding a baby, her face solemn, eyes too large for her narrow face. The corners of the image had curled with age. The glass cracked in one place. He noticed her looking. His voice, when it came, was quiet and distant. "Had a daughter. Once." The fire popped, a knot of wood catching and breaking apart. Neither spoke for a long while. The wind rattled softly against the eaves. The old dog moved somewhere in the corner, a faint rustle of straw. He rose at last and crossed the room. From a trunk by the far wall, he drew a thick, woolen blanket and placed it gently around her shoulders. The warmth sank into her, and for the first time in what felt like years, the cold began to leave. The fire crackled. The room dimmed as the day gave out. Shadows lengthened, moving across the floor and climbing the walls. She lay down on a narrow cot against the wall. The stranger took up a place by the window, leaning against the frame. The storm outside shifted and turned. The snow falling harder, the wind curling through the pines. The sounds blurred into one another, the steady hiss of the fire, the restless sigh of wind against wood, the faint scrape of the dog settling again. In sleep, Elsie dreamed of the tracks behind her, the endless rails stretching out and then vanishing into a snow-choked field. Somewhere ahead, a voice whispered her name. Not sharp or urgent, soft, like the memory of something once loved and lost. You're safe now. She didn't wake until morning. The world outside was buried in white, the pines sagging lower beneath the weight of it. A pale light sifted through the frost-covered window. She lay still for a long time, listening to the wind, the settling of the timbers, the faint crackle of embers. When she finally sat up, the man was by the door, an axe slung across his shoulder, the handle worn smooth. He spoke without looking back. "You'll stay as long as you like, girl." She nodded, though no words rose in her throat. Near the cold grate of the fire lay the scrap of cloth, now a sooty rag, its edges curled and darkened by ash. She didn't move to pick it up. Instead, she pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and stepped out into the snow. The pines loomed overhead, their heavy branches catching the wind. A crow called from high above, a single, hollow sound in the stillness. The man waited for her a few paces ahead, his boots marking the only path in the snow. Elsie followed him toward the woods,